And I think you and I are on the same page where it's like, if you want to be really competitive in the sport, it's kind of a must. If you're going to be a really, really high level athlete, you got to be able to touch on so many things that you're going to need 2 sessions.
Yeah, if you're a single session athlete, it's either a 3 hour session or you are the exception to the rule because of your training age or some other variables in your life that allow you to do that.
Yes,
But for the majority of people who are coming up in the sport now, I would say it's a necessity.
for sure.
The fitness movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all at one place, zorfitness.com. Today we're going to be talking about when it is time to introduce double sessions, so 2-a-days. And we're going to talk through that. There's a lot of factors that can go into it. Yeah, basically an endless amount of things that we probably could go into here. We're going to try to maybe go with some avatars and see what makes sense based on that. You would kind of want to introduce like who we're talking about when we're speaking about these double sessions, Chris, and then like maybe who is it not for along with that.
Yeah, for sure. So just to put some context around the conversation, guys, we're going to be talking about when someone who is maybe relatively competitive or looking to be competitive within the sport of CrossFit, when it might be a good idea for them to start doing 2 sessions a day or 2-a-days. We're going to stay away from the average everyday CrossFitter who's maybe not looking to compete in the sport. There's a lot of rabbit holes we could go down, but blanketly, Ben and I agree that there's really no sense in someone who's just looking to get fit, looking to lose some weight, build some muscle, whatever the case is, doing 2 sessions a day. That doesn't make any sense. So we're just looking at it around the sport.
Yeah, there's probably very few scenarios where it makes sense for someone who's GPP in any sense of the phrase to actually want to do 2 sessions. So we're definitely going to gear towards the competitive CrossFit athlete. So we're going to kind of jump right into the meat of the question, which is like when is it time? Like when should you start thinking about adding it in a second session? So obviously this assumes that people are either going to typically be training in the morning or typically training in the evening. And then to introduce a double day, shocker, you're going to either add in the morning if you're normally a PM person, or if you're an AM person and you normally work out then, you're going to have to add one in the PM, which in and of itself takes some getting used to for a lot of people. So to me, that's probably where I think of first is like, okay, let's give this person an introduction to training at a different time of day. And that's sort of like the first place that I typically start with people is like, just kind of like a new exposure of like, you're not used to getting your arousal heightened at this time of the day. Let's do that and see what happens and like see how you feel in that session. And it's obviously going to be something that maybe not obviously, but it'll be something that's very like introductory, pretty easy initially, just to get them into the habit of like training at that new time.
Sure. Yeah, I think that makes sense, especially maybe this is a stretch, but especially someone who's used to working out in the afternoon or the evening and then asking them to work out, we'll say relatively early in the morning, that can be tough. And so giving someone like something easy to do in the morning, I think is something that can really start that integration well. I think for me, first step, even before I personally do that, is I try really hard to set expectations. And so it's like, there's nothing wrong with doing 2 sessions a day. And I think you and I are on the same page where it's like, if you want to be really competitive in the sport, it's kind of a must to be able to get the volume in and the intensity in that you want to. Maybe not a complete must, but if you're going to be a really, really high level athlete, you got to be able to touch on so many things that you're going to need 2 sessions.
Yeah. If you're a single session athlete, it's either a 3-hour session or you are the exception to the rule because of your training age or some other variables in your life that allow you to do that.
Yes.
But for the majority of people who are coming up in the sport now, I would say it's a necessity.
For sure. It's very rare now that you find a semifinals athlete that's doing 1 session a day. And I don't mean 1 session a day in terms of like cycling. Like there's plenty of people that might do 1 session a day at various times of their year or various times of their schedule. But when I say 1 session a day, I mean like 365, like I just show up for an hour, right? Like that doesn't exist anymore. But for someone who's thinking about doing it, or maybe it might be a good idea for them, the first thing I think about is like counting the cost, right? It's like, okay, let's talk about what this is going to look like for you, right? What does your day to day look like, and when are these sessions going to get in? Because I don't know about you, and for me, I've had people be like, "Yeah, I want to do 2 sessions." It's like, okay, cool. This is what that means, and then they're like, "Oh, I can't do that." It's like, okay, well, then I don't care how bad you want to do this. That just kind of ended the conversation. Have you ever had that?
I think more so the fact that like people like the idea of doing more,
Yes.
but then when you actually give them more, they realize that what it takes from a recovery standpoint, from a lifestyle standpoint, from a like super practical, like I have to eat more, I have to do more laundry, like I have to drive to the gym twice as many times, like all of that sort of thing that goes along with it. So yeah, I think like you said, like setting expectations for me, part of that is like as we go into the conversation, if someone's interested in that, or I think it's time for them, and I kind of spur this conversation of like, hey, maybe we do start to introduce some of these second sessions, then it's like, if things start to spiral for any reason, we're just going to take it away. And it's not bad that it takes away. It's just the reality of what we're dealing with.
For sure. And I think it's one of those things where it's like, at some point, the pulling back might become necessary. And we'll get into that part of the conversation a little bit more. But from a human psyche standpoint, people feel like, oh, I'm a failure. I can't do this. And so like to try to avoid that the best we can, I think setting that like a great example is like, I might have someone who's a relatively good athlete who's like, hey, whether it's spurned on by me or them, we're approaching the conversation of 2 sessions a day, right? Someone who, quote, makes a living, right, coaching CrossFit classes, paid hourly, like whatever, it's way different and can be easier to find pockets of time to do 2 sessions than someone who's like, yeah, I'm an accountant or I'm a hedge fund manager. It's like, all right, so you need to work out at 5 a.m. and then you need to work out at 7:30 p.m. for your PM session. Like that could get really hard if I'm working out from 7 to 9 and then having to turn around and wake up at 4:30 to get a session in from 5 to 7 or 5 to 6, right? Like counting that cost and what that looks like you said, within the lifestyle factors and recovery factors, I think is important, right? Now, everything always looks better on paper than it does you know what I mean, in practice. But if it looks really bad on paper, might not be so great in practice, So I think that's the first place to start. And then I think what you said is a great plan. It's like, okay, cool. We're gonna start. You're gonna start with, I'm making this up. We're gonna do a half hour, 45-minute AM session that's pure aerobic, 60% easy work, and then we'll hit your quote unquote CrossFit session in the afternoon, right? Like that's it. Or vice versa, right? I'm someone who wakes up ready to rock, ready to go. Cool. You're going to do a CrossFit session. When work is over, you're going to come, you're going to do this. No extensive warm up needed, but you're just going to get some work in, breathe a little bit, and just start to build that aerobic base until you're able to handle a little bit more intensity because you're used to the routine.
Yeah. And almost always for me, I found very few exceptions where that's not the case, where I don't start somebody with like a low cyclical session for that first second touch, just because it is so like, it doesn't require any like, mental ramp up really. Like you just kind of walk into it. It doesn't require nearly as much time because just as you said, you're like literally rolling into it. You don't need to like warm up before. It's not like you're doing snatch progressions where you got to warm up for a half hour. It's like, get in, you sit down on the bike and you start pedaling and then you're into the piece immediately. And it's like, for a lot of people, it's like, it's a section where you can basically just like check it off. You're like, did I do this? Yes or no? I did it. Great. And you can just kind of like mentally move on. It's very like low mental, emotional, and physically taxing. And it's just like, just as I said before, it's like getting the person into the habit of just showing up and going through the motions initially, because that's like the most important thing, is just getting them into the habit of like, oh yes, I can come to the gym at this time, feel okay at this time, and start moving around at this time. And then eventually, after they've shown that they can be consistent with that over the period of at least several weeks, in my mind, then it's like, okay, you can take that. And if it really depends where you want to progress them as an athlete, but it could be like, okay, maybe start to add a little bit of intensity into that. It could be that like you start to like maybe add in some like resistance training into that, where it could be like, okay, let's stay with that like low easy session and like maybe add it at a second spot in the week. Again, just with the complete goal of like, let's build this consistency. Yes, it's going to have some benefits to like your sport, which is the whole point of like us building in that way, but it allows them to, without again having really much tax, to just get into the habit of actually going about the thing.
Yeah, it wouldn't make much sense to be like, all right, day one, AMPs, snatch balances at 90%. And it's like, bro, I haven't woken up this early. And, so yeah, I think that's a good call. So let's assume for a second that you have someone who's, and maybe we should set the stage a little bit. I think this is good for someone who's looking to be competitive at the sport and is already relatively competitive, right? Like, or maybe someone who shows like, maybe you have a young athlete who's super resilient and already shows propensities to be like, whoa, you're probably going to be really good at this. So it's like, okay, we're approaching the conversation. We set the tone of this is what it's going to entail. This is what it's going to look like to fit in your lifestyle. Does that make sense? Cool. We've already started to drip and drab and add some of these low cyclical sessions. At what point now, Ben, do you say, okay, now is like where we can start to adjust what some of these sessions look like?
Yeah, to me, that they have to prove that they can be consistent with it first. So like, and I think that goes twofold. I think consistency is just like a matter of showing up and like checking the box that you appeared at the gym at this time and like I actually went about your work. But I think it's more than that. I think it's also like consistency for CrossFit requires someone to be able to recover from what they're doing. Because if they don't do that, like if they're not able to recover from the work that they're putting in, eventually they'll get to the point where they break. And for some people, they'll go a whole lot longer than somebody else just from like what they can tolerate from a mental standpoint, but everybody will reach that point. If you're, overkicking your coverage, you're eventually going to pay for it. So, and to me, that's like usually what that shows up is just inconsistency, like I said, but they just miss a session. They're like, what happened here? They're like, I slept in on this day. Or this thing popped up and I just, whatever. And it's like, that happens like 2 or 3 times over the course of like 2 to 3 weeks. And you're like, okay, something's not adding up here. Like, and you find out that they're actually not recovering from what you were giving them. So it's like, once they prove to me that they can show up consistently and put in that work, even if it is super boring, super easy, then it's like, okay, now we can start to play with the factors within those sessions and actually make it something that it resembles a little bit more like training, like what people would traditionally think of training.
For sure. Yeah. And I think that's important to look at is that recovery aspect, especially even their regular sessions, right? So let's say we usually have someone who works out in the afternoon and let's say they've been doing it for a little while. Like you and I have probably gotten a decent rhythm on like what to expect and how they should feel. And it happens, right? Where it's like, oh, you have a bad session here, or you have to skip a session because, you didn't sleep great the night before, got an argument with your significant other, like whatever.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things where it's like in the beginning, I'll expect maybe a slight uptick of that just because they're not used to it. But if they're recovering, they bounce back and their sessions start to look the same, right? But it's when you start tracking it and it's like, oh man, like we are getting nowhere near these percentages and things become a slog. It's like, okay, hey, to use your term, we might have outkicked our coverage here. And if we outkicked it with easy cyclical work, like I can't give you anything else.
Glad we didn't go to the Metcon right away.
Yeah, exactly. Like, man, I was thinking about doing Fran for that session, but man, that bike got you. That 30-minute easy nasal breathing bike got you.
Yeah. And I think part of it is like, for me, it goes back to like, typically that doesn't happen as much if the athlete's ready for it. And like you and I probably have like this gut feeling of like when an athlete's ready and when they're not. And typically I've been better about standing my ground lately. And this doesn't happen all the time, but like once in a while, like somebody like, I want more. And frankly, this probably happens with CrossFit athletes more than a fair amount of other people because they always do want more. But like being like, nope, we're okay where we're at right now. Prove to me that you can go and like hit all your stuff, do it with excellence, right? Like smash every Metcon I give you. And then If that still is looking appropriate, then okay, maybe we'll add in down the road. My point being, like, there are times where athletes are like, I think I want more. And it's like, actually, you're weak relative to the field. And if I give you more, that's not going to help improve that. Like, you need to spend time getting stronger. Or people are like, I want more. And it's like, frankly, you're just like not really fit enough, which sounds maybe bad, but it's probably the truth, where it's like, relative to your fitness level, it doesn't make sense to give you more. Like, you just need to spend some time where your fitness improves and you can do what you're doing and do it better. So it's very much like the hierarchy of like how I think about developing somebody from like CrossFit, where it's like, if you don't have the skills, if you don't have the strength, like, it doesn't really just make sense to pour on more fire onto everything. And it's a similar thing. Like, it's the exact same thing for like this amount of training volume. Like, if you are weak relative to the field, just training more doesn't make sense. If you're, again, don't move super great and your skills aren't up to snuff, then it's like, it just doesn't make sense to give you more. So there are definitely times where I think people want more and I hold them back. But usually if they're like, it's appropriate, it's rare that at that point, that if somebody's lifestyle aligned, their goals are aligned, that they don't have consistency when we add in that new training. Like, okay, we've added in a session or two extra, each week. And it's like, yes, it is super easy and they're consistent with it and they're able to express that.
I'll speak for myself. I've been a little sneaky in the past where it's like, oh, I want a second session. And like you said, it's like, I'm worried about this movement pattern, this, that, and the other thing. So that second session is like movement work. And it's like, active mobility, stretching, stuff like that. It's like, cool, I got no problem. This is what you need to work on. And it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, if you can't stay consistent with this, like, this is what you need. Like, you can't like eat your vegetables before you have dessert. Then it's like, I can't give you this other stuff, because I think, like you said, the people who do it and do it well are the people who accept that there are certain things you have to do to be good at the sport. And easy aerobic work, active mobility work, positional work, skill work, like all the boring stuff is part of it. And so you have to have the right mindset to go into doing that. So yeah, I think that all makes sense. We had a previous conversation, and full disclosure, I don't know. No, this recently did air around priority sessions. And I think that can also get a little tricky when you have multiple sessions in a week, because for people listening, the biggest key for us is like, okay, once you have the routine in place, it's the recovery piece, because it's way easier for the body to recover from 1 to 2 hour session once a day and have basically 24 hours. Yeah, I'm training every couple hours type deal.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess we would be looking at, okay, from a recovery standpoint, what would those, how would you kind of structure those sessions once someone gets into it?
So I think building off where we start our starting place, which was like easy cyclical work, or like you said, it could be like movement, accessory work, joint health, that kind of stuff. You just start to add in stuff that's like just a little bit more than that, right? Like, okay, they did like snatch progressions in the morning and some accessory pieces for like hamstring, glute, like hinging accessories, and maybe some like shoulder stability stuff. It's like, okay, in the evening, what would pair well with that? Maybe it's like, okay, let's do our easy cyclical stuff, some moderate conditioning that's like low eccentric movements, and that's pretty easy relative to the person's ability level. So for like a high level athlete, it could be like step ups, plank work, some strict pull ups, some stuff like that, where it is like, for a high level athlete, all that stuff's super easy, but it's not just cyclical, right? So it's now like you're adding in maybe some like kettlebell swings. So you're getting like the weightlifting work, you're getting gymnastics, you're getting, maybe you add an erg into that. So it is a little bit more resemblance of CrossFit. And then over time, you can either build volume in that, or you can start to layer in a little bit more intensity, where it's like, okay, let's do a box jump step down now. Let's do a kipping pull up, and let's do a kettlebell snatch instead of a swing, right? And you just slowly start to progress in those sorts of ways, where it's like they're just adding it's like a tiny bit more challenge each time you come back to it. And over time, it's like 4 months down, 6 months down the line, you realize like, oh man, this kind of looks like a CrossFit session now, or oh man, this kind of looks like more like a weightlifting session now, and it's not just like that easy cyclical work anymore. And to me, like that's what progression is.
Yep.
Evan Pycon, when he used to work for TTT, would say like, oh, like progression's like you have like iPhone 5 and then you go to iPhone 6 and you can't tell the difference. But then you go to like iPhone 10 and it's like, whoa, this is completely different. And like, that's exactly what athletes do with like the designs all the time that we write. It's like, week 1 to week 2, cycle 1 to cycle 2. It's like, yeah, this is a little different. And then it's like 6 months down the line when they're at their, getting ready to compete, they're like, whoa, this looks entirely different if I look back at my training from 6 months ago.
Sure.
And that's sort of like how I think about like introducing those second sessions is like start with the basics, make it really easy. And then over time, by the time the athlete realizes that, oh, they're in more intensive training, it's just like what they do now. They don't even know the difference.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's super important to think about and realize is that a good coach is going to progress it that way. Some people who, and I think I think we've been in that boat before. I'll speak for myself. I've been in that boat before where it's like early on when I just started to learn the sport, it's like, okay, I got to do more. It's like you end up just doing hard training all the time instead of like really staggering the intensity of your sessions.
Do you have a topic that you'd like to request as a future show or just a question about training? Reach out to me. My email is ben@zorfitness.com or you can DM me on Instagram @zorfitness. Lastly, head over to zorfitness.com if you want to browse all of our previous shows with in-depth show notes as well as educational content for all things training.
I think for me personally, the one time where I really did the most double session training was during COVID, right? Because I had the most time. And I think, there were times when I was doing that where because of what my needs were in the sport, I might have been doing, let's call it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Let's call it 9 sessions a week. And like 5 of those sessions might have been strength related, if not more, right? Like there were days I would do an AM session with call it snatch progressions, heavy back squats. And it was so much volume, like that was the entire session. And then my PM piece was like my single leg work, my, my accessory movements for those same things. And so there's a lot of things you can do with that. But again, it's like you have to be smart about it where a lot of people, like anyone when they first get into the sport, we're all kind of stupid, is like, they're just like, all right, I got to do more. And it ends up just being more Metcons because that's the sport, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, like you mentioned, making sure you have those priorities lined up, staggering the intensities after you progress people in, it is how you have all that volume and continue to make gains in the sport.
Yeah, I think what you just said is a really good point. It's like it was impractical for you to add more volume into that morning session with those snatches and back squats because the volume was already so high. It took me, an hour and 45 minutes to warm up for my snatches, go through my stuff, do my accessories for my snatches, do my back squats. So it's like, by the time I got there, if you were to do any single leg work, if you're going to do anything, you would just been like, this is either going to be the session's so long that it doesn't practically fit into your day anywhere, or it's just you're going to be so drained from that and the quality of the tail end of that session just plummets. So it's
I think we've all seen, I'll say for sure I've seen it, is let's assume that in terms of practicality of time, let's assume that a 3 to 3.5 hour session makes sense for somebody, right? Let's just say that. In terms of work though, I don't care who you are, the end of that session is never going to be the same level of quality as the beginning of that session.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's where, again, another barrier or not barrier, but maybe marker of, okay, when do I start doing 2-a-days is that as well, where it's like, okay, I have to add in this work, and I'm recovering from it. But as I keep going, my session's now almost 4 hours long. And for me, right, not only was I physically drained, but it was mentally I don't even want to do this right now. And so it's I feel like that 90-minute to 2 hour mark is like where most people in our sphere start to really tail off, right?
Yeah.
Or they get to their accessory work, which is super important, right? For joint health, maybe honing in on some positions or whatever the case is, and they punt on it. They're just like, I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
And so I think that's another marker where it's important to look at that and make sure, you don't get to the point where it's like, man, this session is so long and the volume is so much that I'm done. Like, because over time, one session is not a big deal, but over a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 months, it's like you've now missed out on all this work because you've been pigeonholed into having to do it a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that normally if I'm telling an athlete that they need to do more, it's because I know what their goals are and how we're pushing them, and they are recovering from it. And it's like, practically, this is just going to break down at some point if we continue to go down this road. So we have to split it. We have to. Like, at a certain point, like you're saying, like the quality is just going to fall apart. So it's like, okay, we have to take the volume on the tail end of the session where we're working on this like quality that's like related, but like far enough different where it makes sense to split it, and we have to move it into this PM session, and we can do a lot of other things that will again have like supplemental benefits, like the aerobic stuff that we were talking about before is usually like my go-to thing is like, okay, sure, we can do some like, so for example, like what you were doing was like that snatch back squat. Okay, that's like its own session because it is so much volume and you need so much volume and intensity through that. And it's like, okay, let's take that single leg, some of the joint health stuff, move that to the PM, and then just maybe put that bookends of like easy biking or easy ski erg or something like that, right? Like easy cyclical work on the front, the tail end, or both ends of that session. And it's like sandwich that in the middle of your other stuff that you actually really needed to get in. And then that's sort of like gravy, right? It's like you're only gonna perform better on game day because you've had like some of the like lower easy cyclical stuff. You'll recover better, and again, it's like not super taxing, so it's a great benefit. And then you're also getting the benefit of splitting that session in half, where you get feeling fresher at the front end of that session, where normally you would feel like garbage because at the end of the first session. So that's like one of my big indicators is like, this is just too much to be doing at once, so we need to split it.
It is.
Well, let's go into how like, is it, so for example, you have some higher level athletes that you work with. Is it like, okay, if we're getting up to in the neighborhood of like 6, 8, 9, 10 sessions a week or more, it's like, do any of like the principles change with that, or is just like everything elevated? Like, how do you think about it? Like going from like, okay, we just added like 1 or 2 into the week, like moving from like 5 to 7 to like, okay, now we're approaching like 10 plus sessions a week.
So what do you mean? Like, when do the principles change in terms of what goes into those sessions?
Yeah, like do you think about that differently at all? If it's like, so obviously if it's like only 2 additional sessions a week, it's like you move from like, okay, you have 5 training days and 2 easier recovery days, like rest to recovery. So it's like 3 on, 1 off, 2 on, 1 off, like the typical 7-day split for most people. Just say you add in, say normally someone trains in the morning every day that they train, you add in, Wednesday and Monday, you add in a PM session for them, and it's like easy cyclical work. Like at a certain point, at least in my mind, it starts to shift a little bit where like if you have that number of sessions, there's just going to be like, it becomes a lot more tricky to like jigsaw everything in, like you were saying before.
Yes. Okay. I see what you're saying now. Yeah.
So like, how do you balance that? Like, I know we started with like a lot of the easy cyclical stuff. Is that like still a staple in that? Like, just how does it shift as we get more and more like towards the, semifinal games level athletes versus like the recreational trying to be more competitive athletes?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it depends on the needs of the individual, right? And so you'll have a lot of high level games athletes where it's pretty consistently that their AM piece is like longer and cyclical based, right? And so, for example, I'll use the guy I work with, Mark Kwan, who's been a games level athlete, multi-time semifinals athlete. His AM session is almost always something long and cyclical until maybe he gets closer, a little bit closer to in season. Then he might be hitting a workout, like an actual workout in the morning or something like that. And then he tailors it back off as he gets closer to competition. Now, for those guys, the reason why that's the case is long cyclical pieces become part of the sport, right? Like you have to have the tissue endurance, the cardiovascular endurance to go longer than 20 minutes, right? Like you're just going to get to a semifinals or games level where you might have a 45-minute plus workout. But then also so much of it is based on recovery, not just the ability to recover in between sessions, but when you get into the competition to be able to continue to go hard essentially every workout, that you need a really, really wide base, right? And so for a lot of those guys, the AM session is a lot of times something that's like long and easy, and it's like super long. Like I've seen him do hour-long pieces on a ski erg, right? Now, if you start to tear it down, for me, some of those sessions can be someone who's skill-based, right? So it's like I have someone who has a certain skill but needs to develop it more. Like, again, the intensity there is low, but it's something that they need to work on, right? And so there's a lot of different ways you could do it. You could mix and match, kind of like you mentioned. So like I could easily put like, hey, you're going to do a 30-minute long assault bike ride at a 60% pace. Every 10 minutes, including minute 0, you're going to do this gymnastics work. So they're getting touches on those skills while developing aerobically. But it's important, I think, to puzzle piece it. I don't like seeing like great example is 2-3 sessions in a row that are just like really intense sessions, because it just gets to the point that you can't recover.
Yeah, 100%. That's actually one of the things that I look for is like, I really can't give someone more than 3, it's probably pushing it, but like intensive sessions in a row.
Yes.
So like, for example, I'll speak from personal experience, so I don't speak for any of my athletes, but like if I have, just say it's the start of my week, Monday AM is something that's like, strength based. That's like, okay, for me, it might be like, I'm doing some snatch progressions, heavy front squats, and some accessory work. And then it's like in the PM, I have like a sport-based metcon with some hanging gymnastics and some barbell cycling or something. And then it's like, if I come back to Tuesday AM and I do something intense again, Tuesday evening is going to be trash at that point. Shot. So I either have to do an easy session at some point there if I want intensity on Tuesday night. So like, for example, it'll probably be like, for me, it's usually like, okay, either do like easier cyclical stuff Monday morning and then push it with strength work and maybe a metcon at night. Or it's like, okay, you can make both of those more intensive, but then Tuesday morning is basically just like recovery, easy zone work type stuff with some movement work. And then I feel okay enough on Tuesday night to push it again. And then it's like, again, I probably can either come back Wednesday and do something that's more intensive, assuming Wednesday night's going to be something that's easier, or I can flip-flop that once again. But it's like, either way, I'm getting at least one lower session in at some point between Monday, probably evening, and Wednesday morning.
Yeah, and you could still gear that easy session towards something the person needs to work on.
And so it always is for me.
Oh yeah.
Or for anybody, actually. But yeah.
Right. So like I mapped out something for someone who needs to work on gymnastics, right? Like if you need to work on gymnastics, I can easily mix that into an easy aerobic piece. You're touching on sets of a movement that are that you can accomplish, right? If you have a max set of, 10 bar muscle ups, I'm not asking you to do sets of 7. You might be doing like sets of 2 or 3 to work on stringing them together, but you're never in danger of failing a rep there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
For someone who maybe, struggles in a snatch, something I listened to a lot was, Max El-Haj with Training Think Take. Like he did a podcast one time about Travis Mayer, how he had him doing something for this snatch every single day. And like, you hear that and the untrained ear would be like, my God, what are you talking about every single day? And it's like, asking him to like do an empty barbell SOTS press or like a complete warm-up progression with an empty barbell to just find positions, that's snatch work. For that guy, that's as low intensity as it comes, right? But
it's progressing him towards finding better positions in the snatch, right? And so to map that onto someone you and I might work with, it's like, okay, you need to work on getting stronger. Maybe you need to work on the Olympic lifts. Like, we can work positions and speed at relatively light weights and not have it beat up your joints, right? Or even section out the movement. Like, we're going to do really light block work because through the middle of your lift, you have this hitch, right? And so it's like, there's ways to mix and match intensities more than just, am I sprinting or am I not sprinting, right? There's so many different ways you could do it. And varying it is what allows athletes to continue to adapt despite all the sessions.
Yeah. One of the formats that you mentioned before is actually one of the things that I've used a lot, which is like you're on a cyclical thing, and then it's like, again, if we have that athlete who's starting off in their double session, it's like you start them with just that, like 30 minutes assault bike, easy, go. And then it's like, okay, 30-minute assault bike, easy, and then it's like every 10 minutes you're doing 3 rounds of 4, step ups, 6 kettlebell swings, 8 lateral line hops, or something super easy, right? And then it's like, again, over time, that's just going to, you could extend that, you could add intensity, you could change the movements up that are a little bit more powerful. But basically, it's like you said, like you're just slowly progressing that person towards a higher intensity, and then when they get to pretty close to like their ceiling in terms of intensity, then it's where you really have to jigsaw those puzzle pieces together a little bit more of like, okay, now we're at the point where you're capable of handling more intensive training whenever you want throughout your day. So, but now you run into the problem of you can't do that every day or you'll die. So now it's like, yeah, we gotta figure out a way to juggle your weekly skeleton of your training week so that it makes sense and that you can actually sustain and have your best quality each of those sessions, and not make sure you're staying ahead of that, where it's not like, oh, I actually needed a low session on Wednesday morning and I waited until Wednesday night and now my Wednesday morning was trash. And it's like you end up playing a lot more of that with the high level athletes. Yes. At least in my experience of like, this is how we jigsaw your week into place. And it really matters when we have these lower session days, what they consist of, where your priority work is, like we talked about the other day, like where that actually goes. That becomes way more important, because if you don't have those pieces in the right place, the quality of their work just goes down. And that's like the most important thing, is the quality. Like if the quality's not there, you don't get to do more. Like you have to have the quality. So figuring out how you can do that without, just like sandbagging workouts.
Yeah. And, from there, it's like, okay, we talked about, well, let me back up. One of the first conversations I have with a client who comes to me and says the goal is to like compete at a really high level, one of the first conversations I have with them is like, cool, let's do that. Here's how this works. Here's the line. Here's the line of like injury.
I've heard this speech before.
Yeah. Here's the line of injury and problems. For you to get really good, we're going to have to be like right here, where it's like now, sometimes I might be a little too low. Sometimes we might spill over, but if we don't push the envelope, you're never going to get to where you really need to go if your goal is to be as competitive as humanly possible. However, sometimes the envelope gets pushed. So it's like, when do you know to say, hey, we are like to use the term again you used, we've outkicked our coverage. Like we got to pull this back. Yeah.
I mean, I think it depends on the athlete. This is where like the coaching part of it comes in, where it's like you need to be talking with them, communicating with them, and having systems in place where you are tracking their recovery with either subjective or objective markers, hopefully both. But if you're doing that and hopefully just talking with them and figuring out like when they feel okay, when they feel bad, and like just like reading their body language if they're in person with you, as to like, yeah, you just don't look good. What's up? Right. And it can be as simple as that, where it's like, yeah, like I'm a little bit beat up right now. Like my joints don't feel good. I don't feel like I can get in good positions. One of the first things for me is like their strength numbers just don't go well. Like they're able to do their conditioning work. They're able to slog through it, but then it's like they go to lift and it's just like the top end strength just isn't there. And it's like that nagging injuries, like little stuff that's just like popping up too often. It's like, okay, obviously like stuff's going to happen sometimes, but like this is happening too frequently. Like this shouldn't be at this sort of frequency. And then it's like, yeah, like before, like they're just missing sessions or they like skip stuff. They like start missing out on pieces. And it's like, we just need to pull back so you can get all your work in and feel good about it again.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's no exact science or order. It really depends on the person. But like you said, nagging injuries, lack of desire can be a good one. You know what I mean? I think a lot of the high level athletes in our sport, it's like they're the type of people you have to like pry away from the gym. And so to hear people being like, the gym was literally the last place I wanted to be. Um, Listen, every once in a blue moon, we've all been there. But to hear that, like, okay, well, you said that once last week too. What's going on here? Right? Like that can be a good marker as well of overtraining. So yeah, I mean, being on the lookout for that stuff to be able to start to pull that person back, I think is super, super important.
Yeah. And to me, like, so Chris, like what does pulling back mean? Does that mean deload? Does that mean permanently removing a session? Does that mean, pulling out a certain time of day for now? Like, what does that look like?
I think the first thing, and you might go about this differently. The first thing I tell someone is like, okay, cool, let's take today off. Right? Because sometimes it could just be as simple as like, all right, we're going to take Wednesday off. We're going to take Thursday off. And they come in Friday and they're like, bro, I'm ready to take on the world. And it's like, okay, cool. You just needed a day off. Like there's nothing wrong with that, especially because whether we like it or not, lifestyle factors play into this. What's your work stress? What's your lifestyle stress? Are you sleeping? This stuff, this, that, and the other thing. And so, maybe you have someone who's been waking up at night a couple days in a row. Okay, cool. Take the day off, get a good night's sleep. Let's see how you feel in a day or two. And they're like, man, weird. I feel awesome. It's like, okay, that's all you needed. But so the first thing I might say is like, hey, just take the day. And then if a day off here or a day off there doesn't help, then it's the conversation of like, hey, I think we're training too much. We have 9 sessions, let's say two sessions a day for the 4 days during the work week, their traditional work week, and maybe one on Saturday. It's like, okay, cool. Let's pull back on maybe 2 of those days and see how that feels. But again, it also depends on where they're at, right? Like if someone's in Mayday mode, like I've had athletes who don't tell me things for a little while.
Yeah.
And then they're like, something, my shoulder feels like it's about to fall out of the socket. And it's like, weird. When did that start? 2.5 months ago. It's like, what? 2.5 months ago? Yeah. You know what we're going to do? We're going to take a week off and then we're going to slowly build. You know what I mean? There is a ripcord at some point. But I think general rule of thumb is like, all right, let's slowly pull back till we find that sweet spot again and then build back up.
Yeah. And I think there can be 2 things that maybe go wrong in this. And it could be like, it's either the athlete or the coach, right? Maybe circumstance, but I obviously the circumstances are always changing. So you have to have good communication and like systems in place, like I said before. So it's like either the athlete isn't telling you something or you're not listening to them. It's usually one of those 2. So it's like, it's the athlete's responsibility. So if you're one of our athletes, this is your responsibility. It's your job to tell us if you're having stuff happening. And it's your job to trust us that if you tell us something, that we're going to figure out what's most appropriate for you, even if it's not what you want.
Right.
And sometimes that could just be taking a day off. Sometimes what I'll often do is I think people sometimes will get like sometimes if they don't argue against you, if you've taken the day off, it means that they're really in a bad place. Typically. So it's like at that point, take the day. And they usually don't argue with me. But then if it's like, if they're just sort of like, hey, I'm dealing with this little bit of extra fatigue. And it's like, for whatever reason, I realize that in the language that they're telling me their feedback or like their weekly check-in for me, things like that. It's like, I'll just go in and like modify a little bit of their training and not even tell them. And like, that's obviously a big part of why we get athlete feedback. And it's like, for me, it's like I will basically just like go in and like see like, okay, if it was like, they have 5x5 back squat, it might be like 4x5 and now it's a lower percentage by like a few points, right? And I do that like 6 or 8 different places throughout the week and just like reduce the total volume by just a little bit. And it's like a week or 2 goes by and they feel like they're a little bit fresher and they don't even maybe know why.
Yep. You could even do that movement wise, like, my knee's kind of barky. It's like, okay, cool.
Oh yeah, for sure.
We're going to do the same clean progression. You're just going to power instead of squat.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Like that would be like maybe one of my modifications. If someone's like, oh, I have this joint thing going on. It's like, okay, how about instead of like something that's like going to put you really deep into like shoulder flexion, like a kipping bar muscle up or something, or a kipping ring muscle up, that would be even more maybe. It's like a rope climb is like just as good, but it's probably going to like reduce the amount of irritation to get that end range. So it's like, okay, let's sub out that for that. And it's like, again, the athlete might not even know why, but it's like a good coach would be able to sub that out. And yeah. And if they need to, they can relay that information, but they don't even necessarily have to.
Yep, definitely.
Cool. Yeah, I think that kind of covers it. Is there anything else that you think we should go over with this?
No, I think that's a good place. And again, just to circle back to the beginning of the conversation, I think having a conversation on whether it's wise to start doing that and relative to your goals with a trained coach, whether that's someone at your gym or someone like us, I think is good. But I think we touched on all the major points for sure.
Yeah. If you guys have specific questions, again, we're here. Reach out to us, talk to us. We enjoy that sort of thing. It's what we're talking about.
We're here for you. We're here for you.
We're here for you, especially if you pay us. We do lots for free, Chris. We should be able to get paid sometimes.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah, but feel free to reach out via email or Instagram, and we can answer you guys' questions. You know where to find us. We'll leave it at that. Thanks, Chris.
You got it.
Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.